Experiences as a hospice nurse was very hands-on, working with families, working with patients, getting them to where they needed to be with symptom management, accepting death, very one-on-one. When I worked in ICU, that's where I got most of my experience with dealing with death and dying, and there wasn't a lot of education. It was kind of hit and miss. I didn't get a lot of education in my own nursing program. So my education came from learning from others, a lot of on-the-job, education, screwing up and realizing it the hard way and doing better the next time.
For death.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have a lot of students, I've now taught it long enough that they're coming back and saying that they've really learned something, they're applying it, and they'll send me questions over Facebook or, just general, this pain management isn't working, what would you suggest? So I really feel it's made a very positive impact.
For death.
Absolutely. When you can see it up front and have to deal with it. Also in our clinicals for Med-Surg, I try and get students in with any end-of-life patients. Nursing isn't all about starting an IV. It's not all about meds. It's working with patients at their hardest times. And I think death is hard for everybody.
I do think incorporating a hospice clinical would be beneficial to students. The only challenge about that is of course, finding places that are willing to have students, and really to make the rotation meaningful, you need to have several days with the same families and patients, so you would get that experience or get a similar experience to what you would have when caring for patients that you built a rapport with and families that you built a rapport with, because at some point you really have to move your focus from the patient into the family. And it's very different when you come in. I can say this from experience. It's very different when you have a patient and you take the patient assignment and you come in and the patient dies an hour or two to your assignment. Then when you have built a relationship with the family and built a relationship with the patient, especially when you've tried to save the patient. In ICU, was my situation a lot. We would try our very hardest to save the patient and then realize that there was not a good outcome for them, or not a meaningful outcome for them. And so you've put all this effort into saving them and trying to give their family hope and support, and then your focus has to change entirely, and you may be the one there with them when they pass, and that's a very different experience than just coming on and seeing someone pass and experiencing that with their loved ones. So I think in order to make it meaningful, you would need to have a rotation that had enough contact with the family that you built that relationship. In regards to my experience with death, I've experienced death with patients that I had little to no relationship with, and those that I really had a significant relationship with. Especially when I worked at the wound center. I worked at the wound center during the week, and then would still pick up hours in the intensive care unit. And a lot of my wound center patients had chronic diseases and severe chronic diseases, and they would come in and be admitted to the ICU, and they'd have an overwhelming infection that would be complicated by their other medical problems. And it was very difficult because I knew I'd seen these patients on a weekly basis, sometimes a twice weekly basis, for a couple of years. It was very difficult, much harder on me emotionally to be at their side, but at the end more meaningful. Even though it's more tough emotionally, it was more meaningful to be there with them through that journey, because death is a journey. Death is not just the minute that a patient stops breathing and their heart stops breathing. It's a whole process, and that's something that hospice really does a good job with, is involving family and really making it a meaningful process to everyone, so it's easier at the end for there to be acceptance. And patients tend to grieve a little bit, or patients' families tend to grieve a little bit better. And I've also too, of course, had the experience where I've walked in, gotten report, barely started my shift, barely gotten to know my patients, and a patient coded and was gone. It's still difficult to sometimes to deal with the emotions, all the emotions of the family, but as a nurse, you don't feel that same sense of loss as you do when you have a relationship with the patient and the family.
I think it's varied depending on the exposure the student gets, and so we know that that varies site to site and patient to patient. So I don't think that there's a consistent algorithm for students to have that kind of exposure. I think it just depends on where you are and where you are on any given day and who you're assigned to take care of that day. So they really like it. They like it because they get to see how compassionate the nurses are. And I think that's one thing that comes through on their evaluations, is that they're very surprised at how compassionate the nurses are, how involved they are in with the families, and that they even support the families even after the patient is gone, so they provide services well beyond. I think it's also really good for them to see from a financial standpoint how it's paid for, who pays for it, volunteer services, things like that. So they seem to really like hospice.
Okay.
I think that they might be more prepared for what that looks like. So we've had patients that students have had in the acute care setting that have died, and they weren't prepared for that. I think that when you go into hospice, you're thinking that you're a little bit more mentally prepared for that. In fact, twice I've had students go into a home with hospice, and the patient had already passed away when they got there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're a little bit, they have a different context for that.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think so.
No.
I don't think that it's necessarily something that everyone is interested in. I think that you get exposure to it in different ways, but I don't think that they have to necessarily take a whole course in it in order to, be prepared for it, give a higher level of care. I think that students give high levels of care even without having taken a whole course in it.
Mm-hmm.
And plus you get the concepts threaded through the curriculum in every area. So you might learn about, we talk about grief and loss in intro. They talk about fetal demise in obstetrics. So it pulls through like a thread. And then again, in community, everybody has exposure
Mm-hmm.
in hospice.
For death.
Again, I think that, when students, and this is just from when teaching med-surg, students want to be in the hospital, and when they go in the hospital, they want to take care of acutely ill people.
Mm-hmm.
They do not want to take care of, elderly, long-term care, that category of people that are more immediately facing end-of-life kinds of situations don't always tend to be of great interest to students.
Mm-hmm.
So if I assign them, if I were to assign them patients who were older and, probably more at the end of life, they become very discouraged, and that comes through in my evaluations. They want to hang IVs, they want to, get right in there, and they want really sick people. And another thing is they want to make people better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not always possible. And particularly when you're at the end of life, the focus is not on those kinds of acute interventions. It's really on more of peaceful and respectful passing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that they get that opportunity in long-term care, although I know that long-term care has changed, and so they don't get the same length of time or whatever. And in the hospital, I try to, as a clinical instructor, I try to vary who they get to take care of. But I can tell you that if they get elderly patients one after the other, they get really discouraged. And so I think that it's probably good that it's threaded through as a concept throughout the curriculum.
I think that for the most part, they likely have basic proficiency, but they aren't experienced or prepared in any way for any advanced role in end-of-life care. Currently, end-of-life care is integrated within various clinical courses where we talk about end-of-life care in pediatrics, critical care. Community health does a rotation in hospice, usually one day. Unfortunately, given the amount of content that has to be covered, end-of-life care becomes probably a little marginalized based on everything else you have to know to be a nurse. So the problem with making it a requirement is we are already at the maximum amount of credits we can have for nursing. So we're not able to require any more courses above the current credit load that we require. We can strongly suggest that students take it as an elective, but we can't force them. I think we do have a hospice rotation on a small scale. I think a bigger hospice rotation is difficult, and one of the difficulties that we have is that hospice is predominantly home care, so it would have to be in community health, and it's very difficult to gain access to hospice, I think likely because the nurses protect their patients, and so making it a teaching opportunity is a little more difficult than your average clinical assignment. I think one thing that might need to take place, and this is something that I think hospitals are addressing, is when you're transitioning to practice, having LNAC training as part of your transition to practice, if you didn't get it as an undergraduate, would be very beneficial. And it's something that I think nurses who are transitioning to practice would be ready for, and it would not impact the content that's already saturated in the nursing program. I think an optional hospice rotation, if we had the faculty and resources, is something that could occur because it wouldn't be a required course at that point.
Okay.
But the issue again would be staffing and being able to afford to have that course as an option.
Okay.